Christmas morning arrives in Clarksville, Tennessee. 3 young children wake up excited for presents. Their mother is nowhere to be seen. At first, nobody fully understands that something is wrong. The youngest child is only 2 years old. Another is 4. Their son is 6. The family had only recently moved into the area after Susan's husband was reassigned through the military. They did not have a car, nor did they have a phone. And according to her family, Susan Lund had spent the previous months trying to adjust to a completely different life. The night before, on Christmas Eve, 1992, the 25-year-old reportedly left home around 7:30 p.m. to walk to a grocery store. And then she never came back. For years, some people believe Susan had simply abandoned her family. There were reported sightings and rumors, even claims that she was alive in another state. But nearly 30 years later, investigators would uncover something that completely changed the case. Hundreds of miles away from Clarksville, hidden inside a cold case file that had remained unsolved since the early 1990s, was a horrifying discovery nobody had connected to Susan at the time. And the truth raised even more disturbing questions than the disappearance itself. Susan Maynard Lund was born on November 29, 1967. She grew up in Indiana as part of a large family and was known by relatives as outgoing, caring, and deeply attached to the people around her. Her sisters later described her as someone who loved animals so much that she constantly brought home stray cats and dogs. According to family members, she especially had a soft spot for injured animals. Years later, her daughter Crystal would remember one story in particular. Susan had apparently crawled underneath a dirty, unstable shed just to rescue a small kitten for her daughter. That memory stayed with Crystal for the rest of her life. Susan eventually married her high school sweetheart, Paul Lund. Paul served in the military and had recently returned from Germany before being stationed near Fort Campbell, close to the Tennessee-Kentucky border. The couple relocated to Clarksville, Tennessee, sometime in late 1992. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, the move appears to have placed the family under increasing pressure, and the Lunds were reportedly struggling financially. They lived in military housing off base. They did not yet own a car. They also did not have a home phone installed. That meant Susan often had to walk long distances for basic errands, while caring for 3 small children. At the time she disappeared, those children were just 6, 4, and 2 years old. Susan was also reportedly pregnant with her 4th child. According to her sisters, she missed her family badly after the move to Tennessee. Back in Indiana, she had been surrounded by relatives. Now she was isolated in a new state, without transportation and without much support nearby. But despite the difficulties, relatives said Susan loved spending time with her children. Because she was no longer working during the day, she finally had the opportunity to stay home with them full-time and watch them grow. Her sisters later recalled how much that meant to her. That detail would later become extremely important to the people who knew her best. Because almost immediately after Susan vanished, rumors began spreading that she had voluntarily abandoned her children and started a new life elsewhere. And according to her family, that theory never made sense. December 24, 1992. Started as a fairly ordinary Christmas Eve. Susan had reportedly spent the day at home with the children while preparing for Christmas morning. At some point that evening, she allegedly decided she needed to go out for groceries. According to later reporting, she may have wanted ingredients for a last-minute pie. But one detail has continued to confuse both investigators and people following the case ever since. The grocery store she supposedly planned to walk to was several miles away. And because it was Christmas Eve, there is a strong possibility the store had already closed by the time she left home. That uncertainty has remained one of the first strange details in the case. Susan's daughter Crystal would later remember begging to go with her mother that night. Susan told her no. It was the last time Crystal ever saw her alive. Around 7:30 p.m., Susan reportedly left the family home on foot. The weather was cold, she carried her checkbook with her, and then she disappeared. When Susan failed to come home later that evening, concern quickly began building inside the house. By Christmas morning, it was clear something was seriously wrong. Paul Lund contacted police and reported his wife missing. Search efforts began almost immediately. Investigators searched around Clarksville, while family members desperately tried to understand what could have happened. At first, the disappearance appears to have been treated seriously. Susan was a pregnant mother with 3 young children. She had vanished on foot at night during winter, and according to relatives, there was no indication she planned to leave permanently. But almost as quickly as the search began, confusion started entering the investigation. Police began receiving reports that Susan had been seen in different locations after Christmas Eve. Some callers claimed they saw her in Tennessee. Others reported sightings in Kentucky. One report allegedly placed her near Interstate 65 outside Louisville. Another suggested she was in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Investigators at the time apparently considered some of these sightings credible, and that changed the direction of the case dramatically. Because once authorities started believing Susan may have left voluntarily, the urgency behind the investigation appears to have weakened. Meanwhile, Susan's family struggled with details that did not fit that theory at all. Paul reportedly pointed out that no checks had been written from the checkbook Susan carried when she disappeared. Family members also questioned why Susan would suddenly abandon 3 small children she had been deeply attached to. And there was another issue. If Susan truly had run away to start a new life, why had nobody heard directly from her? Why had there been no confirmed phone call, no verified sighting by family, no financial activity, no explanation at all? As the days passed, the case became increasingly uncertain, and then about a month after Susan vanished, another seemingly unrelated discovery would take place hundreds of miles away in Illinois. At the time, nobody realized the 2 cases might be connected. Within only a few weeks of Susan disappearing, the investigation had already started moving in a different direction. On January 8, 1993, only around 2 weeks after Susan vanished, Clarksville police ended the active search effort. The missing persons case technically remained open, but the large-scale search stopped. For Susan's family, that decision became deeply frustrating. According to later interviews, her relatives never believed she would willingly disappear. They also struggled to understand how a pregnant mother with 3 small children could supposedly vanish without contacting anybody she loved. But the situation became even stranger months later. In 1993, investigators reportedly received information about a woman living in Alabama who claimed to be Susan Lund. Authorities appeared to take the claim seriously. At one point, officials even publicly suggested Susan had been found alive and did not want contact with her family. That revelation changed the public perception of the case dramatically. To many people, it appeared to confirm the rumor that Susan had abandoned her children and intentionally started over somewhere else. But Susan's family did not accept it. Relatives later traveled to Alabama themselves to see the woman in person. And according to Susan's sister, they immediately realized the woman was not Susan at all. Despite that, though, the damage had already been done. For years afterward, Susan's children grew up surrounded by uncertainty, rumors, and conflicting stories about what happened to their mother. Her daughter, Crystal, later spoke openly about the emotional effect this had on her childhood. At different points, she believed her mother might still come home. She later became angry and convinced herself that Susan had willingly left. And according to Crystal, some relatives allegedly reinforced that belief by telling her deeply negative stories about her mother over the years. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another investigation was unfolding hundreds of miles away. An unidentified woman discovered in Illinois had already been given a name by investigators, Jane Doe. On January 27, 1993, roughly 1 month after Susan Lund disappeared, 2 young girls were playing near a wooded roadway inside Wayne Fitzgerald State Park in Ina, Illinois. What they discovered would become one of the most disturbing unidentified person cases that the state had ever seen, when, hidden near the roadside, was the head of an unknown female. Investigators quickly responded to the scene. The remains were located near Rend Lake, a large reservoir surrounded by wooded recreational areas and campsites. Authorities had no idea who the victim was. The woman was believed to be white. She had long reddish hair. She also had extensive dental work, including a silver filling. Investigators estimated she was somewhere between 30 and 50 years old, and, well, Susan Lund was only 25. Forensic investigators also believe the victim may have suffered from torticollis, sometimes called wry neck syndrome, due to asymmetry in the skeletal structure of the jaw and neck. As a result, the original forensic sketches exaggerated these supposed facial abnormalities quite heavily. The reconstruction distributed to the public showed a woman with a noticeably tilted face and severe asymmetry. That reconstruction is now one of the most recognizable to ever exist, and according to later investigators, that may have unintentionally pushed people away from recognizing her. The unidentified victim became known only as Jane Doe. Despite the disturbing nature of the discovery, investigators were unable to identify her, and the two investigations never connected. There were other deeply unsettling details as well. Investigators believed the victim had likely passed only 2 or 3 days before the remains were discovered. If accurate, that potentially meant the woman had remained alive for weeks, in the time frame after Susan disappeared from Tennessee. Even more disturbing was the fact that only the head was officially recovered. The rest of the body was never officially located. Years later, Susan's daughter Crystal learned that several campers and hikers who had been near the park around that time allegedly reported seeing what appeared to be a headless body in the lake nearby. To public knowledge, no confirmed recovery was ever made. The case slowly went cold. The forensic sketch circulated for years. A clay reconstruction was also created, but nobody came forward to identify the woman. And eventually, the unidentified victim in Illinois and the missing mother in Tennessee became two completely separate, forgotten cold cases. For nearly 30 years, nobody realized what to us now seems obvious. For decades, the case remained frozen in time. Susan Lund was still officially missing. Jane Doe was still unidentified. And the people closest to Susan continued living with uncertainty year after year. Then, in 2021, the investigation suddenly changed direction. Dr. Amy Michael, an anthropology professor at the University of New Hampshire, contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Illinois and offered to re-examine the Jane Doe case using updated forensic methods. Working alongside writer and researcher Laura Norton, Michael began reviewing the original evidence with fresh eyes. One of the first major conclusions involved the forensic reconstruction itself. According to the new analysis, the original sketches had likely exaggerated the victim's skeletal asymmetry, possibly to the point where it did more harm than good. While the woman may have had some irregularity in her jaw or neck structure, investigators no longer believed she would have appeared nearly as distorted as the original reconstruction suggested. A new forensic image was commissioned through artist Carl Koppelman. At the same time, scientists pursued something unavailable during the early 1990s investigation. That was forensic genetic genealogy. DNA samples from the remains were sent to Astrea Forensics in California to build a profile suitable for genealogy testing. That profile was then uploaded to GEDmatch by Redgrave Research Forensic Services in February 2022. The breakthrough happened astonishingly quickly. According to investigators involved in the case, genealogists identified a likely family connection within hours. The DNA trail led directly toward a missing woman from Tennessee. That missing woman was Susan Lund. Law enforcement contacted Susan's surviving relatives and requested comparison samples. A sibling provided DNA for direct testing. On March 6, 2022, investigators officially confirmed that Jane Doe and Susan Lund were, in fact, the same person. After nearly 30 years, Susan finally had a name again.
Welcome to News 2 at 10. I'm Bob Mueller.
And I'm Haley Wilgus. Lund's head was found in an Illinois state park 30 years ago, but the identification was only recently confirmed. News 2's Chelsea Beimfor spoke with her daughter about the decades-long investigation and how it altered her entire life.
So I have nothing but good memories of her. So it was pretty rough, especially as a teenager growing up without her, needing my mom. I always thought every woman with red hair was my mother, so I always assumed she was still alive. It frustrates me that the cops stopped searching for her after 2 weeks, because there's a chance they could have found her before that. But my mom's been running wild about what happened to her. That had been horrifying for her.
So now her family has confirmation that Lund is dead, but it opens up a lot more questions about the homicide investigation, mainly who did it and why. If you have any information on Lund's death or disappearance, you can call Clarksville Police or the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Their contact information is up.
For Susan's family, the identification brought both grief and relief. Her sister Pamela Reyes later said she cried for most of the day after learning the results. But alongside the grief was something else. Validation. For decades, Susan's children had lived with rumors that their mother abandoned them voluntarily. Now there was no longer any doubt. Susan had not disappeared to start over, she had been murdered. And according to her family, that confirmation mattered enormously to the children she left behind, especially to her son, who had spent much of his life trying to understand why his mother never came home. But while Susan's identification solved one mystery, it immediately reopened another far darker one: who ended her time, and what actually happened between Christmas Eve 1992 and the discovery in Illinois 1 month later. Even after Susan Lund was identified, investigators were left with an enormous number of unanswered questions. In some ways, identifying Susan only made the story more disturbing, because now there was a confirmed and horrifying timeline. Susan disappeared from Clarksville, Tennessee on Christmas Eve 1992. Then, around a month later, her remains were discovered near Rend Lake in Illinois. That gap in time has never been fully explained. Investigators originally believed the victim discovered in Illinois had passed only days before the remains were found. If that estimate was correct, it raises the possibility that Susan may have remained alive for weeks after leaving her home. There is still no public explanation for where she may have been during that time. There is also the question of transportation. Susan did not own a car, and she disappeared while reportedly walking to a grocery store. Yet somehow she ended up hundreds of miles away in another state. No confirmed witness has ever publicly explained how that happened. Then there is the Alabama mystery. Who was the woman who claimed to be Susan Lund in 1993? And why did investigators at the time appear so convinced by the story? That false lead changed the entire direction of the case. It reinforced the theory that Susan had voluntarily abandoned her children. Other questions involve the handling of the original investigation itself. Susan reportedly had extensive dental work, including a silver filling. Yet despite this, no successful identification was made during the 1990s. There are also unresolved reports that campers and hikers near Wayne Fitzgerald State Park may have seen what appeared to be a headless body in the lake around the same time frame the remains were discovered. To public knowledge, the remainder of Susan's body has never officially been recovered. So this could have been a missed opportunity to gather evidence and to give closure to Susan's family. And then there are the allegations made years later by Susan's daughter Crystal. Crystal publicly stated that a relative once claimed to have witnessed Paul Lund physically attack Susan during their marriage. She also described him as struggling heavily with alcoholism during his military service. However, these claims remain allegations, and no public evidence has directly connected Paul to Susan's case. Paul himself passed in 2020, 2 years before Susan was identified. Today, the case officially remains unsolved. Investigators in Illinois and Tennessee continue asking for information about Susan's movements and location. After December 24, 1992, there is still a standing reward for information leading to answers. And after more than 30 years, Susan's family continues asking the same question they have lived with since Christmas Eve, 1992. What actually happened to Susan? Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.